Hello, my name is Diana Strutzenberger. I'm a research engineer working at the Austrian Center for Digital Production. I want to talk to you in this video about the first steps in OPC UA projects and answer a few questions you might encounter on your way when you first start to work on your first OPC UA project. Some of you might have already seen our introduction video, in which our managing director, Dr. Christoph Pollack, introduces the CDP and talks about who we are and what we do. If you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend you to do so. To this video, who is it meant for? This video might be interesting for small companies, project groups, maybe also with research background, and also private persons, individuals who want to start working on OPC UA projects or are basically interested in the practical implementation of OPC UA. However, we assume that you are already familiar with OPC UA and that you have already basic knowledge. So what is on our agenda? We will talk about the initial definition of your use case, how you can start to collect basic knowledge about OPC UA, how you can choose your architecture for your application, how you can identify your tools for the actual implementation process, and how you can evaluate your finished application at the end of your project. Before you, however, continue watching this video, just a quick disclaimer. There are many good video tutorials out there to guide you through the practical implementation process for an OPC UA project. This video is only meant to provide you a first guide to the things you should be clear about at an early stage in your project. If you're fine with that, we continue and start with the definition of your use case. Besides superordinate topics that define your use case, such as the operational area, let's say production environment with multiple machines, or network topology, we wanted to address issues that are more specific for the design of your application. For example, do you want to use the server to simply collect data, or do you also want to control a device or a machine? Do you want to trigger certain actions? For example, do you want to collect motion data of a robot, or do you want to be able to start a robot routine? Now, why is this important? You should think about whether you simply allow write access to certain variables, or when it comes to OPC UA, you might want to think about to implement methods or maybe also programs. How do you verify whether your command has been sent to the controller and has also been processed correctly? The next topic is information security. This is generally an important issue you should think about in an early planning phase. For example, how do you want to manage access control for your application? How are you going to implement authentication and authorization? Then we have discovery. Is discovery necessary for your application, or do you have a purely static structure? Then do you need or do you want to manage historical data? If you do so, you should think about, for example, where to store the data. Maybe directly on the machine or maybe in a database. And finally, you should also think about sustainability and flexibility of your application. Imagine you are supposed to design a server which is easy to configure. Then you should decide whether you want to put in extra effort into the project at an early stage and design the server in a way that you can easily configure it for any variation of your use case. A server which allows you to change its configuration with every startup without any further adaptations might be advantageous for you in comparison to an application that first needs to newly generate code and maybe also compile again. Now, after you've defined your use case and clarified some open issues, I recommend, if you haven't done it already, to collect basic knowledge about OPC UA. You may have alternative solutions to OPC UA in mind. Maybe there are best practices or new procedures that do not rely on or not only rely on OPC UA. Maybe you want to reconsider to use other protocols, for example MQTT, or directly HTTP with a RESTful application programming interface. Maybe a combination of these components could be a proper solution for your application. And maybe there's a more specific standard you could use. For example, MT Connect has established itself as a standard for reading machine tool data. For an example like this, you can evaluate whether you want to use MT Connect directly or implement an OPC UA server, maybe using the companion specification for MT Connect, or even another specification which is fit for use cases with machine tools. Now, of course, if you have decided to use OPC UA, you probably already have enough knowledge. But there might be some additional things you could do at this stage. For example, try to find similar use cases. This might help you to avoid further issues and obstacles during your project, because other people have already dealt with these issues, with these problems, and maybe they have also found valuable solutions. As a researcher, you might have access to sources like databases, which are, under normal conditions, not accessible to industrial companies. These companies would have to visit fairs and special events to enhance their knowledge. Or they also have the opportunity, of course, the chance to work with research institutions which themselves want to get proximity to the industry and also find the chance to actually test the practical implementation of the findings in an environment which is more practical and more similar to actual use cases. Yeah, this is exactly what we do at the CDP. If you decide to stick with OPC UA, you may want more detailed knowledge, and maybe you also need additional sources. Regarding literature, there are 2 books which can be highly recommended. The first one would be OPC Unified Architecture by Wolfgang Manke, Stefan Helmut Leitner, and Matthias Damm. The second one would be OPC From Data Access to Unified Architecture by Jürgen Lange, Frank Iwanitz, and Thomas Berg. Another well-known source regarding OPC UA is, of course, the OPC Foundation. Here you can find the OPC UA base specification and also companion specifications from various industries. Now you have defined your use case, you have basic knowledge about OPC UA, then you could think about the architecture for your application. For example, do you want to access multiple servers from one endpoint via an aggregating server? This could be useful, for example, for multiple clients in a production cell. Then you want, maybe you want a monolithic or a divided server structure, talking about backend and frontend. Imagine having 3 different backends, but you want to provide a similar or an identical OPC UA server for each backend. In this case, you might want to design a front-end solution which works with each of the 3 different backends. And last but not least, what kind of communication model do you need or would you prefer? Do you want to use publish, subscribe, or the classical client and server model? Or maybe a combination of both provides you with the necessary flexibility and scalability for your application. Now, after defining your use case and architecture and doing some research, you can select your tools. First of all, you may want to find an application to design your server address space. There are some open source and also commercially available tools with graphical user interfaces you can use to model the address space according to your requirements. For example, we have free OPC UA modeler or UA modeler by Unified Automation. Then you should, of course, decide which OPC UA SDK or library you want to use. Here you should get a good overview of open source and commercially available tools and packages. Of course, with the important advantages and disadvantages. Then it might be interesting whether the SDK or library has already been certified by the OPC Foundation. Then, of course, what features does the library or the SDK need to support for your use case? Do you need to implement not only simple read, but also history read, for example? How can you integrate your node set files? Does the library have a parser which allows simply loading your node set, or a compiler which may indicate that you need to recompile your application? Are there any support arrangements? And how well is the SDK or the library maintained? This is especially important for open source solutions. And finally, what do you need to access the data of your data source? Are there other interfaces you can use? Are there application programming interfaces you can work with? What services does the interface provide? What services do you need for your use case? Maybe you would need more than one interface for multiple services. What about the technical specifications, such as, for example, the minimum sampling rate? And something I did not mention until this point, but what is also important, or what could be important, is do you need or have synchronous or asynchronous behavior? So after choosing your tools to implement your server, it may be necessary to think about the evaluation after you finish your application. If you have not done it prior to selecting the OPC UA library, you should now define the minimum requirements for your use case and your specific application. For example, how many sessions should your server support, how many subscriptions, monitored items, and again, maybe think about the minimum sampling interval. Then, with these conditions, you can either decide to implement your own test application, or you can use maybe a sample client which is already provided by the SDK or the library you have chosen for your implementation. Maybe you need also another library for implementing the client side, because the actual library only supports the server implementation. Again, there are free and commercial test tools you could use. But what I wanted to mention here at this point is the certification service offered by the OPC Foundation. The OPC Foundation provides test tools for certification of libraries or SDKs, but also tools for other OPC UA clients and server products. If you want to check whether an SDK is certified or not, you can either check their own documentation or their own Git repository, or you could go to opcfoundation.org, go to products, certified products, and browse the list. For example, if you want to check whether the Open 62541 SDK has been certified, you can look for the entry for the company name Calaisito Infotech Private Limited. When you click on the SDK, you can see further information, further details, such as the certified profile, facets, and the version of the SDK, among other important information. And finally, where else could you look for hints about bugs in your application? If your server supports logging, you can always check the log files. This is always a great starting point. But another great tool to track the communication between OPC UA client and server is Wireshark. Now, I don't want to include explanations on how to obtain these tools or how to use them, how to work with them, because as I've mentioned earlier, there's already a good number of valuable videos out there and tutorials out there. So yeah, this concludes my video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos in our webinar series. Thanks.